Most American suburbs built after the middle of the 20th century were designed without sidewalks, and that absence was not an oversight. It was a series of deliberate choices made by federal regulators, private developers, and local governments, each pursuing a different goal that together produced a built environment where walking was never part of the plan. Before the Second World War, the pattern of American residential development looked very different. Towns and early suburbs, including streetcar suburbs built around rail lines running out from major cities, were generally laid out on grids, with sidewalks running the length of nearly every block. Sidewalks were simply part of how a street was built, in the same way a curb or a drainage system was part of how a street was built. Walking to a corner store, a school, or a trolley stop was a normal part of daily life, because those destinations were close enough to walk to and the infrastructure supported it. That pattern began to change with the creation of the Federal Housing Administration in 1934. The FHA was established to stabilize the mortgage market after the collapse of the banking system during the Great Depression, and it did so by ensuring long-term, low-down payment home loans. But ensuring a loan meant the FHA also had to decide which neighborhoods were safe investments. And to make that judgment, the agency wrote detailed underwriting manuals that laid out exactly what a fundable neighborhood should look like. Those manuals did not simply describe lending criteria. They described physical design standards for streets, lot sizes, setbacks, and land use, and developers who wanted access to FHA-backed financing had strong incentive to follow them closely. The FHA's 1936 Bulletin on Planning Neighborhoods for Small Houses laid out a strong preference for curvilinear streets, cul-de-sacs, and courts, rather than the traditional street grid. The stated rationale was traffic safety and privacy. A curving street with few through connections carries less traffic than a straight grid street, and a dead-end court has almost no through traffic at all, which in theory makes it safer for children playing outside. Those loop and lollipop street patterns, as planners sometimes call them, became the dominant layout for new residential subdivisions through the 1950s and into the 1960s, because builders who followed FHA guidance were far more likely to get their developments insured, and insured developments sold faster and financed more easily than developments that did not. Much of this design language traces back to the neighborhood unit concept developed by planner Clarence Perry in the 1920s and to planned communities such as Radburn, New Jersey, which experimented with separating pedestrian paths from vehicle traffic through a network of interior greenways rather than conventional street-side sidewalks. The Urban Land Institute's Community Builders Handbook, published in 1947, endorsed the neighborhood unit as a scalable model for mass subdivision development, built around a central elementary school and a local shopping node, with arterial roads carrying through traffic around the outside of the neighborhood and quieter interior streets reserved for local access. In practice, most post-war builders adopted the curving streets, the cul-de-sacs, and the separation from arterial traffic, but not the dedicated pedestrian greenway network that Radburn's original design had used to make walking practical without conventional sidewalks. The result, across thousands of subdivisions built on this model, was a street pattern that borrowed the traffic calming logic of the neighborhood unit while dropping the pedestrian infrastructure that had made the original version walkable. A curving, low-traffic residential street does not need the same sidewalk provision as a busy urban grid street, at least according to the traffic engineering logic of the period. If very few cars pass through a cul-de-sac, and if that cul-de-sac only serves a handful of houses, the argument went, pedestrians and vehicles can share the same pavement safely enough that a separate walking surface is not strictly necessary. That argument, repeated across thousands of subdivision plans, is one of the direct engineering justifications for building suburban streets without sidewalks at all. There was a second, less technical motivation layered on top of the traffic engineering rationale, and it had to do with image and exclusivity. Post-war suburban developers were selling a specific vision of life outside the city, one built around detached single-family homes, large lots, and green space, explicitly positioned as the opposite of dense urban living. Sidewalks were associated with cities. Removing them, along with curbs, streetlights, and other urban-style infrastructure, was one way developers signaled that a subdivision was authentically suburban and not simply a transplanted piece of the city. Contemporary planning literature and later historical analysis both describe this as a genuine motivation among developers marketing what were sometimes called country or rural-style developments, even when those developments set only a few miles from a major metropolitan downtown. The FHA's influence on suburban design cannot be separated from its record on race, because the same underwriting manuals that dictated street layout also dictated racial composition. The 1935 FHA underwriting manual stated directly that a neighborhood would only retain the kind of stability the agency wanted to ensure if properties continued to be occupied by, in the manual's own language, the same social and racial classes. That standard became the foundation for redlining, the practice of drawing maps that marked racially mixed or black neighborhoods as poor lending risks, which cut off entire communities from federally backed mortgage credit for decades. Levittown, Pennsylvania, one of the largest and most influential post-war suburban developments in the country, excluded black buyers entirely under Levitt and Sons' own sales policy, which was consistent with FHA guidance at the time, and it remained almost entirely white for well over a decade after the Supreme Court had already ruled racially restrictive housing covenants unenforceable. That context matters for the sidewalk question because the same low-density, curvilinear, cul-de-sac-based subdivision design that discouraged walking was also part of a broader package of exclusionary suburban planning. Large minimum lot sizes, single-family-only zoning, and the absence of nearby transit or commercial uses all work together to make these neighborhoods difficult to reach without a car and expensive to buy into, which reinforced the same social sorting the FHA's manuals were explicitly designed to protect. Removing sidewalks did not cause that sorting on its own, but it was one piece of a design language that treated walkability, density, and urban-style infrastructure as undesirable traits to be engineered out of a neighborhood from the start. Cost was the third major factor, and it applied regardless of a developer's intentions around image or exclusivity. Sidewalks are not free to build, and they are not free to maintain. A Federal Highway Administration cost estimate has put the price of building sidewalks on both sides of a residential street at up to $250,000 per mile, a figure that covers grading, concrete, drainage adjustments, and labor. For a developer building a large subdivision with dozens of miles of interior streets, skipping sidewalks on low-traffic residential loops was a straightforward way to cut construction costs without, in the developer's assessment, meaningfully reducing the home's marketability to a buyer who was going to drive everywhere anyway. That last point, driving everywhere anyway, is central to understanding why the absence of sidewalks became self-reinforcing rather than self-correcting. Post-war suburbs were built at the same time the country was investing heavily in highway infrastructure, culminating in the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 and the interstate system it funded. Rising car ownership, cheap gasoline, and new highway capacity all made it easy to commute long distances by car, and suburban zoning codes typically separated residential areas from commercial and retail areas, placing shops, schools, and workplaces beyond comfortable walking distance in most cases. Once daily life assumed a car for every trip, sidewalks stopped being viewed as essential infrastructure and started being viewed as an optional amenity, one that many municipalities did not require and many developers did not volunteer to pay for. Local governments then wrote that assumption into law through their own subdivision regulations, and this is where the suburban sidewalk gap became durable rather than temporary. Many municipal codes historically required sidewalks only above a certain housing density or traffic volume, thresholds that low-density cul-de-sac subdivisions were specifically designed to fall under. Off-street parking minimums, by contrast, were written into zoning codes almost universally, meaning a developer was legally required to build parking spaces for cars, but not legally required to build a path for pedestrians on the same street. That asymmetry in what the law demanded, present in zoning ordinances across much of the country for decades, is one of the more direct structural reasons new subdivisions kept getting built without sidewalks long after the original FHA manuals had lost their formal authority. Maintenance responsibility added another layer of resistance to retrofitting sidewalks into existing neighborhoods. In many municipalities, sidewalk construction and repair along a residential street is the legal responsibility of the adjacent property owner rather than the city, which means adding a sidewalk to a street that never had one can mean assigning a direct cost, along with ongoing liability for injuries from cracked or uneven pavement, to individual homeowners who did not ask for it. That liability exposure has made sidewalk retrofit projects a recurring source of local political conflict, with homeowners in existing no-sidewalk neighborhoods frequently opposing new construction even when city planners recommend it on safety grounds. Opposition to adding sidewalks in established neighborhoods has also had an explicitly social dimension, separate from cost and liability concerns. Some residents in low-density subdivisions have argued publicly that sidewalks would change the character of their street, drawing outside foot traffic into what they see as a private, car-oriented space rather than a public pedestrian one. Housing researchers and urban planners studying this pattern have connected it to the same underlying logic that shaped the original post-war subdivisions, in which the absence of a public walking surface functions as a soft boundary around who is expected to be present in a given neighborhood. The consequences of that design pattern have become increasingly visible in pedestrian safety data over the past decade and a half. Smart Growth America's Dangerous by Design report, using federal traffic fatality data, found that the number of pedestrians struck and killed on American roads reached 7,522 in 2022, the most recent year with complete federal data available at the time of the report's release, a 40-year high and a 75% increase since 2010. The report's authors describe this trend as a direct consequence of road design that prioritizes moving cars quickly over protecting people on foot, and the streets that show up most often in this data are wide suburban arterial roads, multi-lane roads posted for higher speeds, with few marked crossings, and, frequently, sidewalks that are narrow, discontinuous, or entirely absent. The Dangerous by Design data also shows that this risk is not distributed evenly across the population. People in lower-income areas face substantially higher pedestrian fatality rates than the national average, and Black and Native American pedestrians are killed at higher rates than the national rate across most states studied. Older adults face elevated risk as well, with pedestrians between 50 and 64 years of age recording the highest fatality rate of any age group in the report's data, closely followed by pedestrians 75 and older. Researchers studying this pattern have connected it to the same post-war development story. Many of the roads with the highest pedestrian death rates are suburban and exurban arterial corridors that were built to move car traffic efficiently between residential subdivisions and commercial strips, without the sidewalks, marked crosswalks, or lower speed limits that would make walking along or across them safe. Even though those corridors often run directly past apartment complexes, bus stops, and retail centers that lower-income and transit-dependent residents rely on and walk to regardless of whether the infrastructure supports it. Buford Highway in the Atlanta metropolitan area is frequently cited by transportation researchers as a clear example of this pattern. It is a high-speed commercial arterial, 6 to 7 lanes wide including a continuous center turn lane, posted at 45 miles per hour, running through one of the region's most densely populated and transit-dependent corridors. Where sidewalks exist along the corridor at all, they are narrow and set close against the travel lanes. Marked crossings can be a quarter mile or more apart, and bus stops are frequently located across the road from the apartment complexes their riders live in. Local reporting has documented repeated pedestrian fatalities along the corridor in recent years, and the Federal Highway Administration's Vulnerable Road User Framework has since required the Georgia Department of Transportation to produce a formal safety assessment identifying exactly this kind of corridor as high risk. The underlying design logic, an arterial road engineered to move car traffic quickly through a place where a large share of residents do not own cars and depend on walking to reach transit, is the same logic that shaped suburban interior streets a generation earlier, applied instead to the commercial roads those subdivisions feed into. Beginning in the 1990s and accelerating through the 2000s, a planning movement generally described as New Urbanism, along with the related Complete Streets movement, began pushing back directly against the curvilinear, sidewalk-free subdivision model that had dominated American suburban development since the FHA manuals of the 1930s. These movements argue for return to interconnected street grids, sidewalks on both sides of the street as a default rather than an exception, and zoning that mixes residential and commercial uses closely enough that some daily trips can be made on foot. A number of states and municipalities have since adopted complete streets policies that require new road projects to accommodate pedestrians and cyclists rather than cars alone, and some newer developments marketed explicitly as walkable communities have built sidewalks and connected street grids as a selling point rather than an afterthought. That shift has been uneven and, in most of the country, still represents a minority of new construction rather than the norm. The great majority of housing stock in American suburbs was built between the 1950s and the 1990s under the design assumptions the FHA helped establish, and retrofitting sidewalks into that existing housing stock runs directly into the same cost, maintenance liability, and local opposition obstacles described earlier. Municipal budgets for sidewalk retrofit programs are typically small relative to the total mileage of sidewalk-free residential streets in a given city, which means most retrofit programs proceed street by street, over years or decades, rather than as a single coordinated project. Where retrofit programs do move forward, they are usually prioritized around specific safety triggers rather than applied evenly across a city, targeting corridors near schools, transit stops, or locations with a documented history of pedestrian crashes, since those are the segments most likely to justify the expense politically and most likely to qualify for state or federal safety funding. Even in cities that have formally adopted complete streets policies, planning staff have described a persistent gap between the policy on paper and the pace of construction on the ground, because a policy requiring new road projects to accommodate pedestrians does not, on its own, generate the funding needed to rebuild thousands of miles of existing residential streets that were never designed with a sidewalk in the first place. The practical result is a patchwork: newer walkable developments and retrofitted priority corridors on one side, and the much larger stock of post-war cul-de-sac subdivisions, still built to the design standards the FHA helped establish nearly a century ago, on the other. Taken together, the absence of sidewalks in most American suburbs traces back to a specific and well-documented set of decisions. Federal housing regulators built design standards into mortgage underwriting that favored low-traffic, curvilinear streets over walkable grids. Developers used the absence of sidewalks as part of a marketing strategy built around distinguishing suburban developments from cities, and in some cases as part of a broader pattern of racial and economic exclusion tied directly to federal lending standards of the period. Municipal zoning codes wrote sidewalk exemptions for low-density streets into law while mandating off-street parking almost everywhere, and cost and liability concerns have discouraged retrofitting sidewalks into existing neighborhoods ever since. The result is a suburban landscape, home to a large share of the American population, where walking was never built into the plan, and where the safety consequences of that design choice are now measurable in national traffic fatality data.